everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Julie Fannin. I'm one of the co-owners of Naturalist Journeys, along with our founder, Peg Abbott. We're really pleased to have you joining us tonight. We're excited to have John give us a fun presentation on Antarctica. Real quick, before John gets started, this is a little bit different than, say, a land-based Naturalist Journeys cruise. We often get questions about why you should book a cruise through Naturalist Journeys and not directly through the operator. First and foremost, we do not charge you more to book through Naturalist Journeys. So that's a treat. But on top of that, we've done all of the hard work of deciding which departure, which cruise, which company. We've kind of done all of that like filtering for you so that you can trust that there's already a good departure chosen. We're ready to go. It's timed really well for bird life and sea life, and like Antarctica, for example, really good in January. There's really good daylight hours, and John can speak to more about why January is a really good time to go to Antarctica. But on top of that, these are not huge cruise ships, but with 100 and some people on there, it's easy to not feel kind of connected all the time. And so we send a Naturalist Journeys guide, or on other cruises, we'll send a Naturalist Journeys host, and they provide a little more of a touch base in keeping a group together. Obviously, John offers incredibly good interpretation skills and photography skills and photography. He does light photography instruction if you ask. And he'll also send out a trip report and a species list at the end, so you kind of get the benefit of a small group without having to pay extra. And it really helps to add a personal touch to what can sometimes be a little bit of a you don't feel quite as connected to the group. So it's also really nice at meal times to have like your core group of people that you are eating with and chatting with and getting to know. So, well, without further ado, just a reminder, please keep muted, and John's going to take over.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for this opportunity I always enjoy talking about Antarctica, South Georgia, the Southern Ocean. It's played a really important part of my life, and as Julie said, I really enjoy these trips and being able to experience Antarctica again for new with folks that come along with us on Naturalist Journeys and see it through new eyes. It always kind of helps me remember the specialness of this place. A little bit of background about me. I started going to Antarctica, oh boy, I think it was like 1995, 1996, somewhere around in there was my first trip. I worked on a small U.S. Antarctic base on the Antarctic Peninsula called Palmer Station. Started out as a snow shoveler. That was my first job, general assistant, and did a lot of maintenance work around the station over one winter. Wound up returning to that same area a couple years later, where I started my PhD program studying penguins there. Transferred that work to another little island a little bit further north on the peninsula, King George Island, and where I worked at a even smaller place. There were 3 of us in a hut on the beach, studying penguins there. And so it's always nice for me to kind of go home and see some of the sites that I got to experience when I lived there. And like I said, share it with other people. So what I'm going to do tonight is just kind of walk through a photographic journey that kind of retraces the route that a tour ship would take, and just talk about some of the stuff that we might be able to see on any given trip. Every single trip I've done has been special and unique in different ways, whether it's some different species that we see or just experiences with some of the regular species that we see that have been just extraordinary. And I said every trip has just been something has been wonderful about it. So we're going to start off here with kind of a couple of the past groups here. In the lower right, that was the group from the last trip we did, which was a couple of years ago. My first Naturalist Journeys group is in the upper left. That's on Half Moon Island, and obviously the one on the lower right is standing at um, the boss's grave, Ernest Shackleton's grave on South Georgia Island, which is a pretty special place to visit too. And we touch on a bit of the history of exploration in Antarctica because it's so real in the places that we visit, and in Grytviken on South Georgia Island is one of those places. So just a little bit of idea of the group size and a couple of places that we get to visit. This is the standard route for this trip. Which direction we go is often up to the tour company, the ship company, early on, just depending upon their planning. But most of the trips that I've done have left Ushuaia and headed up to the Falkland Islands first. So a couple of stops. You imagine being in the ship, and then we make a couple of landings, usually one in the morning, one in the afternoon, at various stops along this route. First one is the Falkland Islands, including a visit to Port Stanley, and then off to South Georgia. So there's a fair amount of ocean in between the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, but it's pretty vibrant ocean. There's a lot of life in the Southern Ocean, and particularly in January. Opportunities to see whales and all sorts of different seabirds, and just it's a wonderful little jaunt there. South Georgia is, but we'll touch on that when I get to there. But the words don't do it well. I'll show you some pictures. Hopefully that'll help. But it's still not the full experience of South Georgia. It's just a really, truly spectacular, wonderful place. And then another transit across the Southern Ocean, potentially stopping, swinging by the South Orkney Islands as a little break on the way. Start seeing some icebergs, sometimes some really, really, really huge icebergs, and then make our way slowly towards the Antarctic Peninsula, swing through the South Shetland Islands, kind of work our way down the peninsula, depending on the ship's schedule, and then back to Ushuaia, across the Drake Passage, which the Hondius, which is the ship that we will be on, this was from our last trip, is the most stable ship I've ever been on. And I don't have real strong sea legs, let's just put it that way. I've been doing this for years because I love going down, and the cost of being seasick a couple of days is worth it for me. But this last trip on the Hondius, I wouldn't say it was horrible ease, but they were rolling. It was very, very comfortable. Like I didn't get seasick. Of course, I was taking scopolamine patches, just as precautionary measure, but I was able to get up and around, and really impressed with this ship and its seaworthiness and comfortableness, and it's a great platform for a visit to the southern continent. This kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what the other transportation that we use on our journeys to Antarctica. Lower right, that's like Ushuaia in the background there. First thing you get on board is you go through safety drills. Obviously, guest safety is really important to the company. It's important to us. And making sure that people understand the drills on board the ship and all that sort of stuff is first priority. But once we're underway and making landings, like I talked about, usually one in the morning, one in the afternoon when we arrive to places where we can land, it's using these Zodiacs, these rubber boats, and they have a really nice little entryway to get into these rubber boats off the ship. And then it's just kind of cruising around. Usually a subset of the passengers will go on land, and then another subset, half the group, will do what we call Zodiac cruises, and just get in the Zodiacs and go around looking for sights to see things. Lower left was a minke whale that came just right past our Zodiac. We saw them coming towards us and just killed the engines on the Zodiacs and waited, and pretty soon these minke whales were surfacing right next to us. So that's the two primary means of transportation during our trip south. Like I said, we start off in Ushuaia. the end of the world. Beautiful little town. Used to be a tiny little fishing village with a prison, the Argentine prison. But it soon became the kind of the jumping off point for all of the Antarctic tourism into Antarctica, and has really developed into kind of a very touristy hub for the jumping off point into the Southern Ocean. I'm not sure if we're going to have time. I haven't really fully fleshed out the schedule yet, but on either, I think we're going to do a little excursion before we actually get on the ship, and there's opportunities to see things like Magellanic woodpeckers, which took me many years to finally track down, and was able to do this the last trip with a wonderful local guide and visit national park there just outside of Ushuaia. So a little bit of time in Ushuaia, but then we board the ship and head out towards the Falkland Islands. And in Argentina, they're known as the Islas Malvinas. There's a long history there of, and relatively recent history of conflict and claims over these islands. But it's a wonderful little wildlife stop after a couple of days sailing. Rockhopper penguin colonies that we get to visit, and the should have in January fairly grown chicks at that point, with the adults going back and forth to the colonies. And they're pretty tolerant of people. Obviously, we don't want to get too close, but you can see from this photo in the middle that just hang out, sit down next to the penguin colony and watch them going back and forth. It's really pretty neat to see. Falkland Islands is also host to the largest black-browed albatross colony in the world on one of the offshore islands, and like the exact schedule will just depend upon a sailing time to get to the Falklands, but there's opportunities for a few different landings, including some offshore islands that have had their rats eradicated, which really has boosted the some of the bird life that is impacted by rats. So albatross are just, again, you're sitting next to the colony watching all of this happen. It's really fun. Some of the other bird life in the Falkland Islands, I'm on the spot now. I haven't thought about these little guys for a while. Ruddy-headed goose in the lower left, blackish syncloides or tussock bird in the lower right, the Falkland Islands steamer duck up there on the right, and Chorlo. I'm drawing a blank on the plover right now, but yeah, opportunities to see these guys running around pretty close. They're pretty tolerant of people. And then marine mammals, dusky dolphin and Commerson's dolphins. Commerson's dolphins we often see in the harbor at Port Stanley when we dock there. Opportunities to get out and walk a little bit too. That's one of the really nice spots about stopping in the Falklands. There's some estancias that are on the rotation of places to visit. Again, kind of rat-free areas where you have potential to see Cobb's wren, which is a small little bird that forages mostly along the rack on the edge of the water. Magellanic cormorants, again, more rockhopper penguins. You can see this tussock grass in the background. That's really predominant in the Falklands, although it has been impacted by human settlement, and there's an active restoration effort to bring back a lot of that tussock grass where it's been lost in the past. Magellanic oyster catchers, Johnny Rooks, those are the striated caracaras there in the lower bottom. Very inquisitive, very intelligent birds. One of the unique things that I'd never think about going on a trip to Antarctica is hanging out on a pure white sandy beach with penguins, but there's an opportunity to do that as well at a couple of the landings in Antarctica, which is a little bit of a you expect white snow, but not necessarily white sand. And then a stop at Port Stanley, and being able to look at the settlement there, including This beautiful church with those are blue whale jawbones. The Falklands served as a support base for a lot of the industrial whaling that happened in the Southern Ocean, and as a tribute to the whalers and that history, these jawbones form this arch in the courtyard here of the local church. And then we get opportunity to wander around in town, explore the waterfront, stop by an English pub. There's a little red British phone booth still in use on the island, and it's just a nice little adventure there. Last little touch with civilization before we bail off further into the Southern Ocean. Let's see now, why isn't that working? There we go. I got ahead of myself. A little British phone booth, little tavern in the back, and stop by, have a beer. Um, Falkland Island Conservation Trust is a little conservation organization. They inhabit the little building there with a native plant garden out front, and just a neat little community there in Port Stanley. But then we're back on the ship and heading out over to the open ocean, heading towards South Georgia. And this is where it gets really fun. I love standing on the deck looking for birds. You never know what you're going to find, but you're pretty darn certain you're going to see albatross, lots of different albatrosses, black-browed, wandering, royal, gray-headed, light-mantled albatross, and then these petrels of different sorts, white-chinned petrels, Cape petrels, and then there's the prions, the bird in the lower right, which at one point I thought I was pretty good at identifying prions, and then I started taking pictures of them and being able to study pictures, and realized I probably wasn't as good as I thought I was. So that's always an adventure of sitting down with people and trying to work through exactly what prions we're seeing. Pretty good idea which ones are going to be most predominant in different parts of the ocean, but again, it's always kind of fun to sort through and try and figure out which species of prions we are looking at. They're maybe about the size of a dove, and they fly very fast over the ocean. And the field marks to separate them are fairly subtle. And like I said, I thought I could see those subtle field marks a lot better when I wasn't taking pictures of them than when I sat down with pictures and went, oh, that wasn't really what I thought that was. So always a fun adventure to sort through the prions. Then we arrive South Georgia. It's just it again, the superlatives I could spew out here about South Georgia. It's just absolutely gorgeous. You've got these huge, towering, snow-covered, glacier-covered mountains just rising, it seems like, right out of the ocean, with a number of indentations and bays, and a long, very interesting human history as well. Oops. So it's rather verdant in places where it isn't rock and snow covered, lots of mosses, a tussock grass, lichens, and you see this photo on the right, these beautiful little waterfalls kind of flowing off the top of the hills and down to the ocean. Sometimes you can luck out and get some really nice sunny days. There's usually at some point in the time we spend in South Georgia some spectacular lenticular clouds forming over the top of the island, because the island sits in a way that most of the prevailing winds and currents hit the west side of the island, southwest side of the island. And so the northeast side of the island is somewhat sheltered, and these clouds just roll up over the top of the mountains and form spectacular, particularly at sunset. You can get some really beautiful lit up clouds over the island. But the star of the show here is the massive king penguin colonies, and the opportunity to visit some of these places where thousands of birds are gathered. And king penguins have a very unique breeding cycle that different cohorts will overlap with each other. So you'll have at any given time chicks, usually some birds on eggs, and adult birds molting off to the side. So it's a very active, noisy, olfactory experience to go to one of these massive king penguin colonies and get to experience that is really pretty special. There's Linda at the edge of one of the penguin colonies. As you can see, quite happy to be there, and I was really happy to share this moment with her. But it gives you an idea of kind of the view that you get, and yeah. But we also get to see macaroni penguins. This is South Georgia is the place where we generally pick up macaroni penguins. There's breeding colonies scattered around the edge of the island. It's in a little bit more rocky areas, a little bit harder to get to, but we usually make a point of finding and getting close to at least one rock or a macaroni penguin colony. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the human history there. The picture on the left is Grytviken, which is an old whaling base that the South Georgia Heritage Trust has been actively involved in restoration. There's a beautiful little museum there. You can see kind of in the back, there's a church. This was a Norwegian whaling base. That church was built in Norway, dismantled, shipped to South Georgia, and reconstructed there in Grytviken. And it's been very well maintained, and South Georgia Heritage Trust has been securing the site, getting rid of the potential contaminants and danger to people visiting it. There's a few other big whaling stations on South Georgia that we're not allowed to visit because they're still very dangerous places to go. But Grytviken has been cleaned up and has done a really good job of interpretation. Like I said, the museum there, they've got staff on board. It's a place to mail some postcards. They've got a little gift shop. So it's an opportunity to go shopping in South Georgia. And the upper right is kind of probably my favorite stop when it's nice out, is a place called Gold Harbor. Again, another big king penguin colony, but you're right on the beach with this massive overhanging glacier kind of spilling off the mountain in the background. Very, very picturesque. Again, picture of the church there on the left, and just a couple of scenics of Grytviken, and you can see in the back these whale oil containers, these massive tanks that once held the oil that was rendered from the whales that were killed in South Georgia. And they're rusting. They form some beautiful little lines. It's kind of a juxtaposition. I like taking pictures of these rusty angular shapes because they're so different than most of the other pictures you wind up taking in Antarctica. They're very much more centered around the life in Antarctica. And like I showed earlier, the gravesite of Sir Ernest Shackleton. I'm not going to get into that story. I got to save some stories for the trip. But I'm sure many have heard of the story of the Trans-Antarctic expedition that Ernest Shackleton led, and the Endurance, the ship that got stuck in the ice and sank, that they just recently found in the last couple of years. So yeah, and then a couple other really cool bird species that you really don't think about with Antarctica, the duck and a pipit, right? So the South Georgia pintail, and which is a subspecies of the yellow-billed pinto that's fairly common on the South American continent, has made a tremendous rebound in South Georgia, as has the South Georgia pipit. Probably one of the most southerly breeding passerines. They're confined to South Georgia Island, and they were decimated by rats that were introduced to the island by the whalers. Obviously not purposely introduced, but came along on the ships and everything. There was a South Georgia Heritage Trust, again, had a massive rat eradication effort on South Georgia. They figured they had a short window where they could essentially poison out the rats on the island in segments of the island that were isolated by glaciers. So they didn't have to treat the whole island at once. They could do it by sections because those sections were isolated from each other. And it's amazing the response and the bird life. When I first started going to Antarctica, my first stop at South Georgia, I saw a handful of pipits and only on one small offshore island. The last trip, we had South Georgia pipits every single stop that we made. And that's been 20 years that this conservation success story has really made a difference in the life of a lot of the wildlife in South Georgia. And then the marine mammals, the southern elephant seals, southern fur seals. Again, another species that was probably the reason for the discovery of the Antarctic Peninsula early on was because these seals were hunted for their hides. And a lot of people made a lot of money and led towards the discovery of the Antarctic Peninsula. In fact, Palmer Station is named after a New England sealer, Nathaniel Palmer. Just a few more scenic shots of South Georgia, glaciers, towering cliffs, and in the right you can see the zodiac for scale there on that cliff. And big colonies of king penguins, macaroni penguins porpoising through the water, towering icebergs, towering cliffs. It's just a really raw and spectacular landscape. And then we leave South Georgia and start making our way towards the Antarctic Peninsula, and we start getting some different seabirds potentially. One of my absolute favorites is the snow petrel in the lower right, pure white except for that black eye and black bill, and just very graceful. And I always love they're usually not found too far from ice, and so you're getting close to some icebergs or Antarctic continent when you start seeing snow petrels. The dolphin there's an hourglass dolphin. I haven't seen them very often, but they're spectacularly marked. They're an open ocean dolphin. So it always pays to be out on deck and looking as much as you feel like you can, particularly when the conditions are nice. In the middle is an Antarctic petrel, another kind of hard to find bird with opportunities, right? We get closer to the Antarctic continent, and these guys are another very ice-loving bird. They happen to nest in cliffs in the interior of Antarctica and forage out at sea. Always special day when you see Antarctic petrel. And then light-mantled albatross in the lower left are just such graceful, beautiful birds. Always a pleasure to have them following the ship as well. And then we start seeing icebergs. We start getting into the iceberg lanes. These icebergs spin off the side of the continent of Antarctica and start heading out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. These are calved off of ice shelves, sometimes and a lot of times on the other side of the continent, and they drift around the side of the continent until they hit the backside of the Antarctic Peninsula and kind of get spit out into the southern Atlantic Ocean. And you can kind of get on this low upper right, you can get a little bit of perspective of the size of these. Those are penguins sitting there on the side of that portion of that iceberg. So huge masses of ice. And again, the snow petrels just cruising along the edges of these icebergs is pretty spectacular. And then usually when the route goes in that direction, one of the first stops is on Elephant Island or adjacent to Elephant Island, where the crew from the Shackleton expedition wound up getting to land and waiting to be rescued. It's very rarely you can land there. This little spit of land is where this monument is, and the boat that they overturned and huddled up was up against this cliff. I mean, you guys can see my cursor there. And these guys lived on this island for a few months before they were finally rescued. It's also a wonderful place to see fin whales and sei whales. There were reports last year of a huge pod of sei whales, like hundreds of whales, all foraging around Elf Island. It's a really popular place to see that particular species of whale. And then on to the Antarctic Peninsula and a few more new bird species being more predominant. Gentoo penguins are the most predominant penguin on the Antarctic Peninsula now. They've had a tremendous range increase over the last 20 years, 30 years. Adelie penguins are still found there, but their colonies are smaller and a little bit more scattered. And then chinstrap penguins are kind of somewhere in between, a bit more common, but not quite as common as the Gentoo penguins. And then crab eater seals are the most common, probably one of the most abundant large mammals in the world, and we generally see a lot of crab eater seals hauled out on the ice. Obviously not eating crabs, they're eating krill, and so you often see them with little pink stains around their face where they've been stuffing their face full of krill. You said the Gentoo penguin, that's the one we probably see the most of. Very large colonies. They're tend to winter more inshore, and there's so as we've lost sea ice in the Antarctic Peninsula, their populations have really boomed. The Adelies, some of the islands, particularly on the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula, they're still doing quite well, and these places have been occupied for thousands of years. In the upper right photo, you can see it's the term is ornithogenic soil. And it's essentially thousands of years of penguin guano built up where these birds have nested. And you can just see it layering there as the beach is washed out. And then it's just always fun to watch penguins in the water, because that's where they thrive. They look so awkward and ungainly on land, but they look so beautiful, so well adapted as they porpoise and swim through the water of the Southern Ocean. Just spectacular to watch them in the water. And then the chinstrap penguins. These are by far the noisiest penguins. One of their nicknames was Stonecracker penguin because they have this very loud, obnoxious call. But very striking with that chin strap, and beautiful little guys too. They're all the Adelies, Gentoos, and chinstraps are all part of the pygoscelid group of penguins. With you can see this brush-tailed penguins, and their tail feathers look like little brushes. And then if you get really, really lucky, sometimes you get to see an emperor penguin, particularly on the northern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. There's a small colony of emperor penguins that nest just a little bit further south on the west side of the peninsula. I've been fortunate enough to see, I think, 4 or 5 of these birds. One individual was actually molting on land at one of the landings, so you got to see him fairly well. But most often we see them by looking very closely across the pack ice to see if we can find one penguin that just looks a little bit taller and lankier than the more numerous Adelie penguins. So that's always a great day if we wind up being able to discover an emperor penguin. And then there's the skuas. These are the more predatory seagull type birds. On the Antarctic Peninsula, there's 2 kinds. There's brown skuas and South Polar skuas. And in January, when we will be there, the South Polar skuas will be generally associated foraging offshore and eating fish, whereas the much larger and more aggressive brown skuas tend to set up territories around the penguin colonies where they specialize in snagging penguin eggs and penguin chicks for most of their meals. The flighted penguin, I guess, this is the blue-eyed shag. I just love that juxtaposition of black and white and orange and cobalt blue around their eyes. And their back feathers have an iridescent greenish shine too. So probably one of the most colorful Antarctic birds that we can see. Antarctic terns, kelp gulls. These kelp gulls on the Antarctic Peninsula are probably one of the last populations of gull species that still subsist primarily on natural foods. They're big specialists in pulling limpets off of the intertidal zone, and that forms most of their diet for the year. So always another little good species to just watch behavior of as they're foraging in these intertidal zones. And then everybody's favorite, I know everybody wants to go to Antarctica to see the snowy sheathbill because they're just so gorgeous. These guys are about the size of a pigeon, fairly strong flyers, although they don't look like they're very strong flyers. They're the scavengers. These are the vulture corollaries in Antarctica. You can see the bare face is adapted towards getting their face in pretty ugly, nasty places. So you'll see them often buried head deep in elephant seal excrement, dead animals, whatever they can find. I've watched them actually, as a penguin is feeding its chick, it's regurgitating krill up into the chick's mouth. I've watched sheathbills fly into the penguins when they're exchanging that food and knock all this krill out of the adult's mouth onto the ground when then they come back and gather it all up. So they're very opportunistic and adept scavengers in the Antarctic ecosystem. And then the mammals, we talked about the crab eater seals a little bit already. That's the guy in the middle top there. Off to the right is a Waddell seal, and then the two in the middle bottom and on the left are leopard seals. And January is kind of a transition zone as these leopard seals start moving in towards the penguin colonies as the chicks are getting closer to fledging, and they specialize in trying to catch some of those penguins going back and forth to the colony because they know they're going to be concentrated there. And that's pretty spectacular to watch a leopard seal actually catch a penguin. I was imagine it's almost like revisiting a T-Rex eating something. Don't have a lot of big hands to manipulate anything. Leopard seals have flippers, but they do a pretty good job of rendering a penguin into edible bites pretty quickly. Yeah, just kind of a little bit of some folks out looking at the penguins. You can see that on the upper left, obviously there's pretty strict restrictions on how close you can get to the penguins, but the penguins don't have the same rules. So often, if you just sit down and wait, penguins, either chicks or adults, will get curious and come towards you and inspect you. So sometimes it pays to just sit on the beach and watch and wait. You see some folks walking there. It's a little penguin colony in a old whaling site with lots of whale bones in the area. And off on the right is a usual, Zodiac cruise, like I talked about earlier. And we generally try to get our group into one Zodiac. So that we can experience that together. And I usually try to work. I used to work for Oceanwide, the company that we are going with, as a naturalist and guide for the company. And so I know a lot of the staff, and I usually try to figure out a way to get something special for us, whether it's an exclusive little Zodiac cruise or some other sort of special deal, if I can get the expedition leader to agree to it. So we'll hope for the best on that front as well. And then the big whales, right? Humpback whales are most predominant. January is getting to the point where this is probably the best prime time for watching whales. It gets better as the season goes on. So January strikes this really neat balance between the penguins still breeding and being in their breeding colonies and being able to see penguin chicks and birds on the nests, but also being able to see more whales as their numbers increase on the Antarctic Peninsula as the season progresses. There's very interesting pods of orcas, different types of orcas that specialize in different feeding techniques, including techniques where they will find a seal laying on an ice floe and do the synchronized dive at the edge of the ice floe to wash a wave over the top of the ice floe and knock those seals into the water where they can capture them. There is an opportunity on the ships to do some kayaking. That would be a little separate group, but it's an opportunity to get on the water in the vicinity of whales in a little more intimate way than just with the Zodiacs. As a great. It's spectacular to be sitting in a zodiac and having these humpbacks come check you out, forage right around you. Um, you know, they come up and exhale, and this plume of uh, mist comes, so you can get whale breath on you as you're sitting there watching whales. And then just a lot of time to see some pretty spectacular places. Particularly if you can get away from the ship a little bit. The ship is constantly running, so there's some noise there, but it doesn't take very far to get away from that and really truly experience silence. Often the guides, what we'll do is we'll get away from the ship, get out into the icebergs, sit in the Zodiac, and just cut the engine and listen for a while. And the sound of the water and the tinkling of the ice shards rubbing up against each other. But mostly it's just the immense quiet that is really something I don't think we get enough of these days in a lot of the places of the world. And Antarctica is a place where you can really experience an environment unaltered by human-made sounds. And then, like I said earlier, it's just something just spectacular to sit on the beach and watch these animals go about their lives around you. Opportunities to get out and walk, see some spectacular snow-covered mountains. Maybe do a little sledding on your in your ski pants, and just is nice to get off the ship for a little while and get some walking in too when you're trying to do that, and which usually includes, there's a big point of emphasis of making sure that there is a landing on the actual continent of Antarctica, not just some of the offshore islands. So if you're particular about whether or not you've made a landing on continental Antarctica, that's usually a point of emphasis for each trip. And then there's opportunity to experience some of the history of Antarctica, both from an exploration, scientific approach. This particular picture here on the right is Almirante Brown Station. It's an Argentine station in Paradise Bay. That is, most of the bases have been set up and are under the Antarctic Treaty, are there for the purpose of scientific exploration. And sometimes these bases, the scientists are actually still working there, and they allow us to stop by and say hello. But there's also this extraordinary and it's history and it's real, but it's really depressing too to realize just how many whales were killed in this region and processed there. And these whale bones, these areas where it's just massive number of whale bones washed up on the shore from when they were processing those whales, and the remnants of that industry. These are a couple of water boats that were abandoned and left there and have been slowly decaying in that very harsh but preserving environment that Antarctica is. Yeah. And then one of the other really spectacular things is just the ice and the infinite shades of blue. That was one of my first impressions of Antarctica. Was I never knew there were this many colors of blue. Light reflecting off the ice, the various textures of the ice, the compression, how much the ice has been compressed dictates how much light is transmitted through it, resulting in different colors. And it still is something I really cherish every trip. It's just that the blue. It's really struck with me. And then we're back. Wind up coming back. I didn't put any pictures of the Drake Passage in here. Sometimes there are stretches where I don't have any pictures because I'm not feeling all that active. But like I said earlier, the Hondius is by far the most comfortable ship I've ever been on, and I did very well the last trip, so wouldn't expect that to be any different. But again, Ushuaia, back to the end of the world, conclusion of our trip, and time to head home. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. Oh yeah, I had to put my questions slide up. So This is the opportunity to ask a few questions, and I'm going to stop sharing and see what you guys have for questions for me.
Thanks, John. That was really great. Um, I can read questions to you if that's helpful.
Yeah, I can pull up my chat here too.
Kate is wondering, she's heard that Shackleton's grave may not be accessible for much longer, and if that's accurate, are there other activities planned?
Yeah. Um, Obviously the ship company will make sure there are other activities planned. I'm not sure the I did hear that the path to Shackleton's grave was closed last year because there unfortunately avian flu hit South Georgia, and avian flu in particular was very detrimental to elephant seals. And there were just too many dead elephant seals in that portion of the walkway to get from the station to the grave. That was the only reason I'm aware of that it was closed, but that was only temporary because of that particular issue. And I don't know what the course of avian flu is going to be in Antarctica, but it is a concern. And we did have last trip, we did have some precautionary measures to minimize our potential transmission of avian flu in Antarctica as well. That answer the question?
I think so. And I think that, Kim, I think that addresses your question as well. Um, Joanne wants to know what your research was on.
Ah, so I was looking at the impacts of climate change on Adelie penguins in particular, looking at snow deposition to see if changes in snow deposition had an impact on Adelie penguins. And I also looked at what factors influenced where penguins came back to breed. So these very large colonies are broken up into smaller groups of birds. Um, some of them are quite large, others are fairly small. And trying to look at what factors influence when a bird is hatched from one part of the colony, where does it wind up coming back to breed? And these birds, the penguins generally take about 4 years before they're able to reproduce successfully after they've hatched. And so they have some time to adjust where they're going to be. And so I was looking at that sort of stuff.
Dixie has asked if we can recommend a pre-trip birding to our local guide in Ushuaia, and I can answer that. We absolutely can. And honestly, usually a little closer to departure, we'll organize something that's, we know everybody's coming in early, so they don't miss the boat. And we'll put something together that gets into some of the national parks down there and some of the other colonies penguin colonies that are on land. John's photo of those Magellanic woodpeckers is from one of those pre-tour trips, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I,
Um,
I may have gotten a little excited when we found those Magellanic woodpeckers. It was a bird I have been trying to see since I started going to Antarctica, and our local guide Esteban knew where to take us, and there they were. It was really cool.
I think it's Amelia from our Naturalist Journeys team is wondering if you can tell us about one of your favorite moments while you're on a Zodiac.
Oh, oh, there's so many. It's, probably what I mentioned earlier was being in the midst of humpback whales and watching animals come towards you, exhale at the edge of the zodiac and slide underneath the zodiac. So you're watching this massive animal just, 5-10 feet under the water slide underneath the zodiac and come up on the other side. Another one was we were doing a zodiac cruise at the edge of a fairly large Adelie penguin colony, and there were 4 leopard seals taking advantage of these young penguins coming into the water. and watching them chase penguins and catch them and eat them in front of us. Although it was, from the penguin standpoint, it was sad, but watching that spectacle of nature in action right in front of us was really pretty special. And I've spent a lot of time in zodiacs, and they're really great platforms for observing wildlife. You're right there.
Kate is asking if there are options for single supplements, and there are. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what they are right now. It's really good if you email or call our sales team, and they are in constant communication with the operator. And sometimes there are discounts or incentives for single supplement. It depends on what the operator's running in that time. So the most important thing would be to email our sales team, who are Jesse and Laura, and their email address. We'll pop it in the chat. It's travel@naturalistjourneys.com. I have a question, John.
Yeah.
This is really important to us at Naturalist Journeys, and I'm always curious. I think I can talk to it more for other locations, but how does tourism/ecotourism to Antarctica, how is it done sustainably, and how does it contribute to the conservation of, say, the whales that, you go to that old whaling station and you see all these, what humans have done so terrible or
Right.
poorly in
Yeah.
the past.
Yeah.
What are we doing when we go to help contribute to conservation?
So one of the big things, just from a general tourism standpoint, is that there's an association called the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators. And every company that operates in Antarctica is part of this. And they have guidelines built because Antarctica is governed under the Antarctic Treaty, and it's set aside for science. And so this is a privilege that we have to go to Antarctica, and the tour operators recognize that. So they formed this group to self-police, and they work very closely with researchers to identify places that may have gotten too many visitors, and they will avoid those sites in a subsequent season so that they're adjusting their schedules to adapt to changing conditions. And they have very strict guidelines, of how many people can be on shore at one time. That's why when I said earlier, we generally have half the ship on a Zodiac cruise and another half on shore, because you can only have so many people on shore at once. That's the beauty of having these small ships to do this. The very large cruise ships go to Antarctica, but they never get off the ship. They can't. They're not legally allowed to get off the ship because there's just too many passengers. And once the capacity of a ship, and I can't remember what the limit is, goes past, they're legally not allowed to get off. So there's a lot of protections built in just from the tour operator standpoint, and paying attention to those sort of impacts. Did I get at that, Julie? Is there another part of it? Okay.
That was great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Marilyn is curious how many hours of daylight there are in January.
Well, we never get completely south of the Antarctic Circle. So there is some darkness, or duskness, I guess would maybe be more appropriate. It's obviously in the middle of the austral summer. I'm trying to remember what it was like when I was at Palmer. I would say maybe 4 hours of dusk. So you're operating, I mean, you can be up as long as you want and really not the drawback is you don't get to experience the southern constellations very well because you just don't see them in the middle of the summer. But yeah, about, I would say, 4 hours, and never really gets quite dark.
That's great. Liz is asking if it can't make it in 2025, when we will offer the trip again. And I would say, We have offered this cruise anywhere from mid to late November through January. Um, if you didn't join us in 2025, we would most likely offer it again in January 2026. Does anyone have any more questions? John, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Oh, I could be talk about Antarctica stuff, but I have to save some of it for the ship, right? I can't tell all my stories here. Um, I probably the biggest thing, Julie, is I uh, got this bug to go to Antarctica kind of through mutual friends. It had always been there in my Ranger Rick magazines when I was a kid, right? And I knew at some point it would be wonderful. I never really expected it to happen, but through a variety of different circumstances, I wound up meeting some people that worked in Antarctica. Um, and my wife actually was one of those people. She was working in Antarctica when I met her. Um, and so I had this opportunity to go as, like I said, a general assistant first for the U.S. Antarctic program, and it still is such a spectacular place that it just hooked me. I'm a kid from Montana, and I don't spend a lot of time on the water, and it was very different for me, at least from the water standpoint. But it, it hooked me, and I so appreciate this opportunity to go back and, like I said, share it with fresh eyes, but also be able to provide some perspective from my time that I've worked there. And I don't, like I said, I'm not a really good sailor, and I do tend to get sick, but I keep going back despite that. Right? It's worth it to me for a little bit of discomfort to be able to experience that. And it's just even the pictures that you saw tonight just do not do justice to the expanse of this landscape. If you still want to feel small someplace in the world, Antarctica will make you feel small really quickly.
And it looks like we have one last question. Monty is curious about the weather. What's
Yeah.
the cold January weather?
January, it can be, I always liken it to about March in Montana. It can be chilly, but it's not going to be freezing cold. Um, it will likely have some rain and I almost guarantee some wind, but also the potential for some fairly, excuse me, warm days, 60 degrees. I would say most often it's going to be 40s and 50s. So it's very pleasant, other than, in fact, it's very cold water and the wind is up. But I've never had anybody particularly complain about it being consistently cold.
Great. Well, I think that wraps us up.
Right.
Um, this really is a trip of a lifetime. It's super exciting. And we also know that it's a big investment. And our sales team would be happy to talk you through all of your questions. You can email them, you can call them. They can probably connect you with John or another one of our guides who's been to Antarctica if you have really specific questions. We have lots of trip reports that may help answer those questions. And of course, we have species lists as well. But really getting in and chatting with our sales team, chatting with Jesse, chatting with Laura, we can really help answer those and help you make the right choice for you, right cabin. Oh, and this is also another important note. We work with a travel agent who can help you book your flights because it's really hard to get to Antarctica. And she's really good and she can work with your miles if you have miles. And she can also if there's weather issues or flight cancellations, things like that, she's on it. You don't have to worry about it. And we'll pay her ticketing fee. So there's really no reason not to use her and have that peace of mind. So we make it a little bit easier to get there because I know that can be daunting. Um, with that, We were really glad you joined us this evening and take care. Hopefully we're getting out in the gardens at this point, right?
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.